Good morning and welcome to the fifth session of our series on Rome from founding legends to mistress of the Mediterranean. Today I want to talk about the Second Punic War, which runs from 218 to 201 BC. And there is another artificial intelligence generated image. This is a representation of the Oath of Hannibal. It's quite a nice one. I'm very pleased with that. I'll come to the Oath of Hannibal again in a moment. But here, as the first slide, which I won't take you through, I'll leave you to go through that by yourselves, is a timeline of the second greatest war of the ancient world. I've called it the second greatest war, but you can argue about that. In terms of its outcome, it may have been the greatest war. It's difficult to decide between the First and Second Punic Wars. I've called the First Punic War the greatest of wars because it seems to have killed more people, and it went on for a bit longer than the Second Punic War. But in the stakes and in its outcome, you can argue that the Second Punic War was by far the most important. It runs from about 230 BC, when Rome first became aware of Carthaginian expansion into Spain. It then jumps to 218 when the war begins, and comes down to 201 BC, when Rome inflicted a total and indeed a final defeat on Carthage, which now ceased to be a great power in the Western Mediterranean. And it runs through the whole series of victories and defeats between 218 and 201 BC. I'll let you go through that by yourselves, but timelines are very important things. They're very important things to read alongside maps. Yes, maps are very important as well. Sources. Our main sources for this war, the two big ones, there is Polybius, the great Greek historian. And remember, he was a great historian. He was writing about events that were somewhat before his time, but they were not very far before his time. In some cases, he was able to question people who remembered these events or had heard from people who remembered them. Otherwise, he was able to read the documents. He was very good at going around the Mediterranean world, pulling documents out of archives to find out what people wrote about these things at the time. Otherwise, we have Livy. You have books 21 to 30 of his History of Rome, which cover the Second Punic War. For the most part, Livy followed Polybius. In many cases, he cribbed from Polybius, but he does add a great deal. Some of it he's made up, but in many cases, he adds further information which Polybius didn't have, or which Polybius didn't think important for his own purpose. Beyond that, you have Appian, who is a 2nd century Greek historian. It's not a terribly readable book, but it does contain a great deal of information which you don't find in Polybius and in Livy. Cassius Dio, a very important historian, and he would be even more important if we had the whole of his work. The parts of his work that cover the Second Punic War survive in fragments and in summaries. You then have other sources. There's the archaeological evidence, there's the inscriptions. Inscriptions are very important because they help to tell us who the various officials were at the time. You also have coins, which are of enormous importance. A coin will record a victory which might otherwise not be evidenced in the sources. The location of a coin may tell you something about what was happening. And then you have secondary accounts. You have little comments in works by Plutarch, Cornelius Nepos, other biographical sketches. So we do have a great deal of information about the Second Punic War, which is not surprising, as everyone believed at the time that it was a war of immense significance, and everybody afterwards realized that it was indeed a war of the highest significance. So let's come to the causes of this second great war between Rome and Carthage. The immediate causes. In 221 BC, the Carthaginian general in charge of expansion into Spain, a man called Hasdrubal, was murdered. The Carthaginian forces in Spain then elected Hannibal as their commander at the age of 26. His election was confirmed by the government in Carthage, and he continues the expansion and consolidation of Carthaginian control in the region. The agenda in Carthage is to take over as much of Spain as possible and to exploit it ruthlessly for its human and physical resources. Hannibal's particular agenda is to lead a second, and this time a victorious, war of revenge on Rome. And Hannibal started in the year 218 BC this giant war, this second giant war between Rome and Carthage. And Livy begins his long account of this war with these rather dramatic words. In this preface to a part of my history, I may properly assert what many an historian has declared at the outset of his entire work, to wit, that the war which I am going to describe was the most memorable of all wars ever waged, the war, that is, which under the leadership of Hannibal the Carthaginians waged with the Roman people, for neither have states or nations met in arms possessed of ampler resources, nor was their own might and power ever so great. Nor yet were they strangers to one another's modes of fighting, which the first Punic War had made them understand, and so variable were the fortunes of the war, and so uncertain was its outcome, that those who ultimately conquered had been nearer ruin. The animosity, too, with which they fought was almost greater than their strength. The Romans were enraged that the conquered should be actually drawing sword upon their conquerors. The Phoenicians, because they believed that the conquered had been treated with domineering arrogance and greed. And then we have Hannibal's oath. I gave you Polybius last week, and here is Hannibal. It is said, moreover, that when Hannibal, then about 9 years old, was childishly teasing his father Hamilcar to take him into Spain, his father, who had finished the African war and was sacrificing, before crossing over with his army, led the boy up to the altar and made him touch the offerings and bind himself with an oath that so soon as he should be able, he would be the declared enemy of the Roman people. The loss of Sicily and Sardinia was a continual torture to the proud spirit of Hamilcar, for he maintained that they had surrendered Sicily in premature despair, that the Romans had wrongfully appropriated Sardinia, and even imposed an indemnity on them besides, in the midst of their African disturbances. So this is evidenced in both Polybius and Livy. Livy is following Polybius, but you have some reason to believe that Hannibal devoted his life to the destruction of Rome. Here are the critical maps that we need to look at. Top left, the Western Mediterranean, 264 BC. The Western Mediterranean is divided between Rome and Carthage, and they have no particular reason to object to each other's sphere of influence, except that Carthaginian expansion in Sicily begins to worry the Romans. You have a resulting war from that fear of Carthaginian expansion in Sicily. It leads to a Roman takeover of Sicily, Corsica and Sardinia. But the Carthaginians are left with North Africa and Spain. They're let off with a large indemnity and the loss of those large Mediterranean islands. Over the next few decades, the Carthaginians immensely expanded their territory in Spain. This gave them a great deal of physical wealth in terms of silver, but also in terms of food and all the other good things that Spain affords. It also allowed the Carthaginians for the first time to start raising a large army, not a mercenary army, and the Carthaginians had fought the First Punic War with mercenary armies, which had sometimes fought rather well, especially when led by that Spartan general, Xanthippus, but which mostly hadn't been able to stand up to the Roman armies. Now the Carthaginians were able to raise and maintain a large standing army, and after 20 years of hard fighting in Spain, this was a thoroughly battle-hardened army which was used to the leadership of its commanders. So the Carthaginians have been able to recover. At the beginning of the Second Punic War, they are richer and they're in generally a better position to fight a war against Rome, except, of course, that the Romans now control the sea, and that is a critical fact which for some reason the Carthaginians do not take fully into account. But apart from their loss of those large Mediterranean islands, and apart from their loss of control over the sea, the Carthaginians are in a much stronger position at the beginning of the Second Punic War than they had been at the beginning of the First, and the Romans are not aware of this. The reason the Romans are not aware of it is because as soon as the First Punic War was over, the Romans found themselves deeply and continuously involved in northern Italy. Northern Italy was to them far more important than the Mediterranean because the Gauls were now on the warpath again, and a sudden stab to the south by the Gauls could actually put Rome itself in danger. And so the Romans spend many years fighting in northern Italy, fighting in what is now northern Italy, though at the time was Gaul, or preparing for wars or trying to avoid wars. Italy takes up most of their attention. So the Romans at first ignore the Carthaginian invasion of Spain. They ignore the Carthaginian expansion into Spain. They are completely unaware of the immense enrichment of Carthage by Spanish silver and the recruitment of Spanish men into the first real Carthaginian army. In 230 BC, the Romans at last get wind of what's going on in Spain, and the Senate sends ambassadors to Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian commander in Spain. He fobs them off with an assurance that the expansion into Spain is simply to fund the payment of the indemnities that Rome has demanded. The Romans go away not entirely satisfied, but they don't have any straightforward answer, and they're in no position to start making demands. In 226, Hasdrubal promised the Romans, when they began to look in more detail at what was happening in Spain, that they would not expand north of the Ebro. The Senate then gave a very ill-defined promise of protection to the Spanish city of Saguntum, which is quite a long way south of the Ebro. It is a Roman ally of some kind, slap in the middle of Carthaginian territory. As soon as Hannibal takes over, he decides on a war of revenge against Rome. He will use Spain as his base for that invasion, and Saguntum is an open sore on what is otherwise the Carthaginian coastline of Spain. He needs to take out Saguntum because it is a point of entry for the Romans into Spain. Also, it's very rich, and he wants the money. He wants the money from the conquest of Saguntum to pay his rather large army, and again, he needs it to pay for bribes in the Carthaginian Senate. There are two parties, it seems, in the Carthaginian government. There are those which are solidly behind him, which believe that his idea of expanding deeper into Spain and using it as a base for a war of revenge against Rome is entirely feasible. And there are those which Livy describes as pro-Roman, but who may simply have been wary of Rome and who wanted Carthage to expand not into Spain, but into the very rich hinterland of North Africa. So in 219 BC, Hannibal set about a siege of Saguntum. The government of Saguntum sent a message to Rome saying, "We have an ill-defined treaty of friendship. Will you make good on this?" The Senate decided not to do anything about this in the first instance, but sent a commission of inquiry to Spain to ask Hannibal what his intentions were. Hannibal refused to meet the commissioners, and so they came away with their tails between their legs. The Senate then sent a delegation to Carthage to ask what was going on and to demand that Hannibal should be recalled and indeed handed over to the Romans. The Carthaginian Senate refused, it endorsed Hannibal's actions, and the Romans then declared war. The declaration of war was in 218 BC. The Senate sent armies to Sicily, getting ready for an invasion of Africa. It also got ready to send an army into Spain. It assumed that this would be a rerun of the First War, though this time the Romans had control of the sea, and the fighting would all happen in Spain and in North Africa. But Hannibal had a different idea. His idea was a land-based invasion of Italy. He would start out from New Carthage, or Cartagena. He would march north, he would knock out Saguntum, and then he would march his army over the Pyrenees, through southern France, over the Alps, and break unexpectedly into Italy. Hannibal set out in the spring of 218 BC with an army of 50,000 battle-hardened men and 37 elephants. In the crossing of the Alps in early winter, and it was rather a hard crossing, he seems to have lost about half his men. It was a very expensive invasion. He lost an unknown number of elephants as well. But Hannibal crossed the Alps, and the Romans had no idea that he was doing this. I believe the Senate did receive a message from the government or from the people of Massilia, or modern Marseille, a Greek colony which was under Roman protection, saying, "We've just seen a great big Carthaginian army marching past with elephants." The Senate paid no attention. They didn't expect that a Carthaginian army would be in southern France. They certainly didn't expect that it would burst into Italy out of the Alps. But that is exactly what it did. Oh, and there's one of my artificial intelligence images. That is Hannibal crossing the Alps. The reason I'm using so many artificial intelligence generated images is partly because I can do them, so why not? But also because it's sometimes rather difficult to find decent representations of these things on the internet. But for what it's worth, there is a representation of the Carthaginian army with its elephants crossing the Alps. Don't think the elephants were quite that big, but never mind that. The Romans were not prepared for a war in Italy. The Romans were not at all prepared for a war in Italy because that is what they hadn't expected. but also there were problems with their leadership. And I did mention this last week. When the Romans were conquering the Gallic tribes in what is now the north of Italy, several weaknesses emerged that didn't matter at the time. The weakness was that the Roman commanders tended to operate in isolation from each other. They tended indeed to operate in competition with each other. There was no coordination of the military strategies in the north of Italy. This didn't matter enormously when they were fighting more or less disorganized barbarian tribes, but when it came to fighting a well-led army of Carthaginians, that was an almost fatal weakness. Hannibal arrived in Italy in the late autumn of 218 BC. He immediately took over what is now Turin, and he defeated a small Roman army. This was not in itself a substantial defeat, but it led to a rising of the Gauls, who had only recently been conquered. They threw off Roman rule and declared for Hannibal, and this gave Hannibal an immediate accession of men to his army. He was able to raise his army from the 25,000 who'd got across the Alps to more than 40,000 men. The Senate, taken by surprise, ordered the army in Sicily to come back to Italy and to march north and to join the force already facing Hannibal. They gave up on their plan of an African invasion. The Romans therefore had quite a large army to throw against Hannibal, and they threw it against Hannibal with considerable confidence of victory. This combined Roman force, under the command of one of the consuls for the year, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was lured into combat by Hannibal at the Battle of the Trebia, the river Trevia. The Romans had an army that was larger than Hannibal's, but the Carthaginians under Hannibal encircled the Romans and set about a massive slaughter. It seems that only 10,000 of 40,000 Roman soldiers were able to cut their way out of this ambush. This left Hannibal, again, completely unexpectedly in control of what is now northern Italy, or Cisalpine Gaul. Hannibal now spends the winter in northern Italy recruiting and training even more soldiers from among the Gauls, and he's able to swell the Carthaginian army to 50,000 men. The Gauls are still feeling rather sore at being conquered by the Romans. They've thrown off Roman control, they've thrown in their lot with the Carthaginians, and they're spoiling for a rerun of their fights with the Romans, and this time they think they'll win. So, in a single battle, Rome has lost control of northern Italy, and they're facing a large and confident army of Carthaginians led by Hannibal, and they're beginning to realize that Hannibal is not just an ordinary Carthaginian general, he is one of the great military leaders of the age, maybe the greatest military leader of the age. So there is a map showing the three great battles, starting with the Battle of the River Trebia in 218 BC. Early in the spring of 217, the following year, the Carthaginians crossed the Apennine Mountains unopposed. And again, Hannibal pulls the Romans into a battle that is fought on ground of his choosing. The main Roman army is led by one of the consuls for the year, Gaius Flaminius. Hannibal pulls him into battle by a wholesale devastation of the area that the Romans have been sent to protect. The battle that Hannibal prepares is again an ambush beside Lake Trasimene, and again Hannibal destroys the Roman army. He kills 15,000 Romans, including the consul Flaminius, and takes 10,000 prisoners. He also destroys a cavalry force of 4,000 Romans at the Battle of the Umbrian Lake. At this point, Hannibal begins his diplomatic outreach. He looks very carefully at the prisoners he's taken. If it's a Roman, he's treated very badly. If he's one of the Latin allies of Rome, he's treated very well by Hannibal. The idea is to try to drive a wedge between the Romans and the allied Latin cities of central Italy to get Rome's main allies to defect, to try to isolate Rome in Italy. And although Rome has controlled Italy for a while, its leadership of Italy is not entirely unopposed. It is not something fully accepted by all the other Italian states. Hannibal begins to paint himself not as the conqueror of Rome, but also as the liberator of Italy. This horrifying defeat at Lake Trasimene leaves Rome itself open to attack, but Hannibal thinks that it's too early to lead an attack on Rome itself at the moment, so he marches south looking for allies. Hannibal's great weakness is that he's operating at the end of very long supply lines. He can only get men and money by land all the way from Spain, over the Pyrenees, through southern France, and again across the Alps into northern Italy, and then south. The Romans control the seas, and they keep a very tight control over the sea throughout the war. So Hannibal marches south to look for allies for a knockout blow against the Romans, and he finds that the Greeks, who don't much like the Carthaginians, don't like the Romans either. And because Hannibal is their most likely champion against the Romans, the Greeks, whom the Romans had conquered in the 270s and 260s BC, now throw off their allegiance to Rome and join with Hannibal. The Senate realizes that Rome is losing control of Italy. It's lost control of the north, it's lost control of the south, and it has only the centre of Italy, which can be regarded as solidly on side. It doesn't know what to do. It appoints a dictator. It appoints Quintus Fabius Maximus as the dictator and tells him, you've got 6 months to turn this round. What are you going to do about it? Fabius's answer is, we don't have an answer to Hannibal as a military leader. He's better than we are. If we raise another large army and throw it against him, he'll annihilate that as well. My strategy is to refuse combat. What we'll do is we'll wear him down. We'll follow him around. As he attacks, we will retreat. As he withdraws, we will attack. But we will not face him in open battle. What we will do is we'll wear him down by a war of attrition. We'll tighten the sea blockades. We will try to block the approaches into Italy, and we will defeat Hannibal in this way. It's called the Fabian strategy of not facing your enemy in a frontal attack, but instead snapping at his heels, gradually wearing him down and winning. This was a perfectly good strategy, and later on Fabius became one of the heroes of Roman history. At the time, the people saw it as cowardice. They were feeling rather sore at these two great defeats that Hannibal had inflicted on them, and they wanted a knockout victory. They wanted a big battle in which they would overrun the Carthaginian lines and destroy the Carthaginian army. So as soon as Fabius's dictatorship came to an end, the people elected new consuls for 216, and these were men who promised a much more aggressive strategy against Hannibal. In the spring of 216, Hannibal takes a very large Roman supply depot at Cannae in southern Italy, and you can see that on this map. The Senate reluctantly authorises the consuls for the year to raise a gigantic army of 86,000 men, one of the largest armies ever raised in the ancient world. The plan is to attack Hannibal with overwhelming force. But Hannibal is waiting for them, and Hannibal knows the land on which he'll be fighting, and he has a clever scheme. I don't like military history. I don't do military history very well, and I'm not the kind of person to sit discoursing on how the Roman legions forced their way through Hannibal's deliberately weak centre, but the Libyan heavy infantry moved from here to here on the wings, and they swing around their advance, menacing their flanks. You can read about that on the slide, and you can look at the plan given on the map. What happened was that Hannibal, with a greatly inferior army in terms of numbers, faced the Romans. The centre of his army retreated when the Romans attacked, and little by little, as the Romans raced forward thinking, aha, we've got them on the run, Hannibal encircled them, and this enormous Roman army found itself in the middle of a ring of iron, which then began moving inwards, cutting and cutting and cutting. At this battle, Cannae, the greatest defeat in Roman history, the Romans went in with an army of 86,000 men, and at least, according to Livy and Polybius, at least 67,500 were killed or captured. As I have said, it was the greatest defeat in Roman history. The entire Roman army was destroyed, the biggest army the Senate had ever raised, and there was no other army at the moment. The way to Rome was wide open. And here we begin to see Hannibal's weakness as a military leader. He was of completely outstanding talent, and in military colleges all over the world, his tactics at these three great battles are still studied with some profit. Hannibal's weakness was strategy, knowing when to jump. And here we have some quotes from Livy. Hannibal's officers, after the Battle of Cannae, all surrounded him and congratulated him on his victory, and urged that after such a magnificent success he should allow himself and his exhausted men to rest for the remainder of the day and the following night. Hannibal, however, the commander of the cavalry, thought that they ought not to lose a moment. "That you may know," he said to Hannibal, "what has been gained by this battle, I prophesy that in 5 days you'll be feasting as victor in the Capitol. You'll be feasting on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Follow me. I will go in advance with the cavalry. They will know that you are come before they know that you are coming." To Hannibal, the victory seemed too great and too joyous for him to realize all at once. He told Hannibal that he commended his zeal, but he needed time to think out his plans. Hannibal replied, "The gods have not given all their gifts to one man. You know how to win victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use it. That day's delay is believed to have saved the city and the empire." So after Cannae, the way to Rome was wide open. The Romans had nothing to put in the way of a Carthaginian army that would march on Rome. The Carthaginians would turn up outside Rome, break through the walls, and that would be the end of the war. Eventually, after several years in Italy, Hannibal did make an attack on Rome in 211 BC, and Livy reports, while he was actually in arms near the walls of Rome, a force had marched out fully equipped under their standards to reinforce the army in Spain. The other incident, which he learned from a prisoner, was the sale by auction of the spot on which he had fixed his camp, and the fact that in spite of his occupation of it, there was no abatement in the price. So this is the strategic error that Hannibal made. After Cannae, he could have marched on Rome and finished the war in about a week. He could have occupied Rome, and that would have been Rome's final defeat, the end of Roman expansion, the end of Rome. But he didn't. He waited, and the Romans took advantage even of those few days to pull together another army from here, from there, from wherever they could, and to put it back into the field. And Hannibal decided that the time had passed for an attack on Rome. Hannibal missed his chance. That was it. But the Romans were still in a terrible position. Remember, the Gauls in northern Italy have thrown off Roman control, and they've declared for Hannibal, and they are providing him with recruits. The Greeks in the south have thrown off Roman control, and they've declared for Hannibal. They don't like the Carthaginians, as I've said several times, but they don't like the Romans either. Choosing between the Carthaginians and the Romans seemed an easy choice to make at the time. They would deal with the Carthaginians as and when, but for the moment, if Hannibal was in Italy and he was carving up the Romans, so much the better. They would side with him for the moment. The Romans have only central Italy. What did the Romans do? The answer is they decided to win. They began taking stock of things after Cannae. They accepted that they'd lost northern Italy. They accepted that they'd lost southern Italy, but they still had the centre of Italy. And Livy says, yet in spite of all their disasters and the revolt of their allies, no one anywhere in Rome mentioned the word peace, either before the consul's return or after his arrival, when all the memories of their losses were renewed. Now this consul was the man who'd lost at Cannae, and Livy makes an important point. Such a lofty spirit did the citizens exhibit in those days, that though the consul was coming back from a terrible defeat for which they knew he was mainly responsible, he was met by a vast concourse drawn from every class of society, and thanks were formally voted to him because he had not despaired of the Republic. Had he been commander-in-chief of the Carthaginians, there was no torture to which he would not have been subjected. Remember, the Carthaginian custom was to crucify unlucky generals and admirals, which was perhaps not the best way of dealing with unlucky military officers. The Roman custom was simply to accept that the general had been unlucky that day. There may have been hard looks if the general had not stayed to go down with the army. He may also have been impeached before the Senate and fined or exiled, but the Romans were not in the habit of executing their unlucky military leaders. It is a source of strength in the long term. It gives a certain elasticity to Roman military planning. Now, what are the Romans going to do? They have been brought to the edge of defeat. They have lost 100,000 men in 3 battles, and they've come close to losing everything that they've put together in 3 centuries of expansion. They have lost the pacification of the Gauls in the north of Italy. Many of their Italian subjects and allies are falling away. They're siding with Hannibal. They're even losing control of Sicily because Syracuse, their satellite state in Sicily, has suddenly defected to Carthage. There are actually foreign powers outside Italy which so far have been wary of the Romans and are now joining the coalition of enemies. What are the Romans going to do about this? The Roman response is to keep their nerve. they have suffered these 3 shattering defeats, unparalleled defeats in Roman history, but they decide on a new strategy for victory in the long term. And the strategy is this. They will accept the advice given by Fabius when he was a dictator. They will avoid a further battle in Italy. They know that they can get together a very large army and they can throw it against Hannibal, but he'll simply inflict another Cannae-style defeat on it. So they will avoid giving further battle in Italy. Instead, they will follow Hannibal around. They will deny him access to the resources of Italy, scorched earth tactics, or guerrilla tactics, or Fabianism. They will use their unbroken control of the sea to make sure that Hannibal has no lines of communication to Carthage, except those which run through those several thousand miles through northern Italy, through France, through Spain, through North Africa to Carthage. They will then cut off those supply lines by an invasion of Spain, and then once they've sorted out their conquest of Spain, they will make an attack on Carthage itself in North Africa. And the advantage that they have, the one advantage that they still have, is that their core allies in central Italy remain loyal, and this alone decides the outcome of the war in the long term. I've said that Hannibal was a military tactician of supreme genius. Maybe not Alexander the Great himself came close to Hannibal in terms of his ability to win battles, but Hannibal did not understand overall strategy, and that's something which the Senate did understand, and that's something which the Senate used to killing effect against the Carthaginians in a very long war. We talk about sea power again. At the beginning of the war, the Senate equipped a fleet of 160 warships, and in spite of all the disasters on land, the Senate continued year in, year out to increase the size of the Roman fleet. The Carthaginians never launched a fleet larger than 130 warships. The Roman ships by now were better in quality, and the quality of the naval personnel was higher among the Romans than among the Carthaginians. The Romans were unable to stop the Carthaginian reinforcements of Spain. They were operating too far out of area for that. They were also unable to stop the Carthaginian invasion of Sicily, but they were fully able to stop any reinforcements from reaching Italy. It also meant that Roman armies could move at will along the Spanish coast and land where they pleased. Also of critical importance, the Romans had total control over the Adriatic Sea. Hannibal had made a treaty with Philip V of Macedon, who was himself a great military leader, at least as good as Pyrrhus, who'd invaded Italy in the previous century. If Philip had been able to get an army across the Adriatic to join Hannibal, the Romans would have been in even more serious trouble than they were. But because the Romans kept a tight control over the Adriatic, and Philip had no navy, he was unable to get across the Adriatic. Instead, the Romans could land a small army on the eastern coast of the Adriatic and get a rising of many of the Greek cities against Macedonian control. So rather than being able to join Hannibal in Italy, the king of Macedon found himself fighting a rising of his own subjects. 205 BC, a peace between Rome and Macedon. The Romans made a number of small territorial concessions and put Philip on their list of people to sort out once they had seen off Hannibal. So The Roman use of sea power in that war was of decisive significance, and it's something of a mystery why the Carthaginians never thought to challenge Roman mastery of the sea. Again, this was a weakness of Carthaginian strategy that the Romans used to full effect. So the Romans have control of the sea at the beginning of the war, and their control of the sea becomes stronger as the war proceeds. We then have Sicily. Now, at the end of the First Punic War, the Romans found themselves in control of the entire island. They found it convenient to leave Syracuse as a satellite state. At the beginning of the Second Punic War, the king of Syracuse, Hero, the one who'd been given the gold crown which Archimedes had then tested for him, Hero declared for Rome, and it seemed that Sicily was a solid ally of Rome. But in 215 BC, Hero dies, and his successor, a rather weak young man, is persuaded to switch sides. The Carthaginians promise him half of Sicily as reward. This leads to chaos in Sicily, but then to the emergence of a republican government which decides to side with Carthage. It confirms the switch of allegiance from Rome to Carthage. Other parts of Sicily are disappointed with Roman government. They had expected rather better than heavy taxation, so they join the revolt as well. It's necessary for the Roman commander in Sicily, Claudius Marcellus, to reconquer the island. And the most important part of Sicily to reconquer is Syracuse, so he puts Syracuse under a close blockade. But look at that image in the bottom of the slide. That is Syracuse. Nowadays it's the old part of Syracuse. In those days it was Syracuse. It's almost an island. It's almost entirely surrounded by sea. And the Romans find that they're unable to take Syracuse. Syracuse was defended with great ability, and the stories are that many of the clever machines with which the Syracusans defended their city were developed by Archimedes. Let's have a look at Archimedes, a nice switch from talking about wars. He was the greatest of all the Greek mathematicians. He's the man who discovered and applied an early approach to differential calculus. This is not something we knew until fairly recently because the relevant work seemed to have disappeared. It was discovered in the 20th century by accident, and no one paid much attention until about 40 years ago. Then we discovered that, Archimedes did sort of discover the differential calculus. His other achievements: he's the first man to apply mathematics to an exploration of the laws of nature. He also developed the science of fluid mechanics, where you can drop objects into water and measure their displacement. He also seems to have been a skilled inventor. He invented the screw pump and compound pulleys. One of the weaknesses of Greek science was that it was far too abstract. It was more interested in uncovering final causes than in simply looking at regularities and reasoning from those regularities. But Archimedes supplied that defect. Archimedes, all by himself, tried to overcome that weakness. At the time of the siege of Syracuse, Archimedes was in Syracuse, and he's said to have invented some very clever machines to keep the Romans at bay. And there's images of two of them. One of them is a mechanical claw, which was placed on the sea walls of Syracuse and was able to reach down and grab hold of Roman ships that came too close to the walls, lift the ships out of the sea and drop them and their men back into the sea so that they broke up and sank. Another one, which is still controversial, is a burning mirror, a heat ray, an early kind of laser weapon. You can see how it's said to have worked in this late 16th century representation of it. You have a concave mirror. It would need to be a very large concave mirror, which takes the sun and focuses it onto Roman ships at quite a distance apparently, and to set them on fire. Various experiments show that these things can be made to work under optimal conditions. Whether Archimedes was able to build an early kind of laser weapon, we can't say. It may be that the use of these mirrors was to dazzle the Romans as they sailed forward, but we don't know. It is said that he developed an early kind of laser weapon to use against the Romans. For whatever reason, the Romans sat outside Syracuse for several years. When they broke in, here is Livy, the city was turned over to the troops to pillage as they pleased, after guards had been set at the houses of the exiles who had been in the Roman lines. Many brutalities were committed in hot blood and the greed of gain, and it is on record that Archimedes, while intent upon figures which he had traced in the dust, and regardless of the hideous uproar of an army let loose to ravage and despoil a captured city, was killed by a soldier who did not know who he was. Marcellus was distressed by this. He had him properly buried, and his relatives inquired for, to whom the name and memory of Archimedes were an honour. And there's a representation of the death of Archimedes. He's not drawing figures in the dust, he's writing them on a sheet of papyrus. But you can see a Roman soldier standing behind him, shouting, "Who are you? Tell me your name, and where's the gold hidden?" Archimedes pays no attention and is killed. Marcellus had given orders that Archimedes should be taken alive and treated as an honoured prisoner, and when he discovered that he had been killed, the Roman soldier responsible was heavily punished. Whatever the case, the Romans took Syracuse in 211 BC. The Carthaginian fleet, which had been sent out to assist in the resistance of Italy, refused battle with a much smaller Roman fleet, and after the fall of Syracuse, the whole island fell back under Roman control. Spain and Africa. There on the right is a representation of Publius Cornelius Scipio, or it may be a representation, it may be a priest of Isis, we're not quite sure, but it's quite a nice image, so I've used it. Remember, the Romans have decided that they can't defeat Hannibal in a pitched battle in Italy because he's better than they are as a general. So they decide to destroy Carthage outside Italy. They begin by squashing the revolt in Sicily. They then oversee an invasion of Spain. Two Scipio brothers are sent in to lead the invasion of Spain. In 211 BC, they both die in battle. Although that is considered a terrible thing at the time, it doesn't make any great difference because the Romans soon send reinforcements to maintain their presence in Spain and to keep up their pressure on the Carthaginians. And then in 210 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of one of the dead generals from the previous year, at the age of 26, is given command of Spain. He's young, he's charismatic, and he is Rome's first actual military genius. He's a rather strange man. He believes that he has a direct line of communication with the gods. But undoubtedly he knows what needs to be done, and he knows how to inspire his troops. And in Spain, he begins to turn the tide against Carthage. He finalizes the shutting off of Hannibal's lines of communication and supply. And after that, Hannibal begins to wither in Italy. In 209 BC, Scipio marched south and took the main Carthaginian city in Spain, New Carthage. It was a long and clever siege, and it was followed by a vast massacre of the entire population. This was a war of increasing atrocity. The Carthaginian and Roman peoples were now at fever pitch of hatred against each other. No quarter was given, no quarter was asked. So when Scipio took New Carthage, he slaughtered the entire population. Then, in further advances, the battles of Baecula and Ilipa, Scipio defeats Carthaginian army after Carthaginian army until the Carthaginians are cleared entirely out of Spain. Spain now falls to Rome, and everything goes silent for Hannibal in Italy. He can't get information by sea from Carthage. He can't get anything from Spain or from France. He's completely cut off in Italy, and the Romans begin to wear him down. 205 BC, Scipio returns in triumph to Rome. He's elected one of the consuls for the year, and he proposes that the time has now come for an invasion of Africa. The Senate agrees. 204 BC, Scipio lands in Africa. He begins an invasion of Carthaginian territory. He wins the support of most of the local chieftains. The Greeks didn't like Roman rule in Italy, and the local tribes don't like Carthaginian rule in Africa. Scipio wins over the local tribes, including the king of Numidia, a man called Massinissa. Scipio makes him some rather extravagant promises. He keeps those promises. So the Carthaginians find themselves increasingly isolated and hard-pressed in their home territories. At this point, it goes rapidly to the bad for Carthage. 203 BC, the Carthaginians send a very large army against Scipio, and he brings about the total destruction of this army at the Battle of the Great Plans. At this point, the Carthaginian government, which doesn't have the same firmness of mind as the Roman Senate, decides that it's lost again, and so it had better get whatever peace it can. So the Carthaginian Senate sent envoys to Scipio and said, "What peace will you give us?" Scipio decides to finish the job. So the peace terms that he gives the Carthaginians are that Carthage should formally cede the whole of Spain to Rome. That's nothing much because the Romans already possess it. Further terms are that Carthage should have a maximum fleet of 20 warships, and that there should be an indemnity of 5,000 talents of silver, or 150 tons of silver. The Carthaginian Senate accepted these terms, but was playing for time. It managed to get a ship across the Mediterranean to Italy. They found Hannibal and told him, "You're recalled. Leave your army, get aboard this ship, and come back to Africa. You're needed here to defend the city." Hannibal left Italy with some reluctance, saying that because of this the war was lost. But he went back to Africa. He took control of the best army that his government could give him, and he marched out to meet Scipio. And this was the first big battle between the Roman and Carthaginian main generals. This was the first big battle in which the Romans faced Hannibal since Cannae. Hannibal tried his usual tactics. He began with a massed attack by elephants. But Scipio, as I said, was Rome's first great military genius. He had spent much of his youth studying Hannibal's battle tactics. He knew what Hannibal was going to do. He was prepared. As the elephants raced forward, or as the elephants lumbered forward towards the Roman lines, Scipio kept his army in position. At the last moment, a trumpet sounded, and the army immediately broke up into thin columns of men. The elephants rushed through the lines that opened up, and they were picked off by the Romans. That was the end of the massed elephant attack, which was the main part of Hannibal's strategy. He thought he could finish the Romans off with an elephant attack and then go in to finish the finished job, one might say. Instead, the Romans now attacked. They inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Carthaginians. Hannibal was one of the few men who got out of this battle alive, the Battle of Zama, the battle in which the Romans faced Hannibal and defeated him and wiped out the shame of those three great defeats he'd inflicted on them in Italy. Carthage now had no army, and there was a very large Roman army sitting outside the walls. Hannibal told the Carthaginian Senate, "You'd better give in. The Romans have won. You'd better accept whatever peace terms Scipio now decides to come back with. They won't be nice ones, I can assure you." And they weren't nice. Scipio kept the same peace terms as before, broadly speaking, except that the indemnity was no longer 5,000 talents, but 10,000 talents to be paid in instalments over 50 years. The 20 warships maximum was reduced to 10 warships, and Carthage was further forced to promise that it would not wage war without Roman consent. From now on, Carthage would be a city-state with a hinterland in Africa, and it would function, it would exist under Roman supervision. The Romans have won the Second Punic War, and it's a total victory. Unlike the first victory, where the Romans gave rather generous terms, these were crushing peace terms. Carthage was destroyed as a great power in the Western Mediterranean, but the cost of winning that war was almost as catastrophic for the Romans as it was for the Carthaginians. For almost 20 years, Italy itself had been the main seat of war, and Frank Tenny Roman imperialism. The havoc wrought in southern Italy was irreparable. For 12 years, the Romans and Carthaginians had driven each other over this region, both sides storming cities and laying waste fields as the best method of tiring and weakening their opponents. The inhabitants who did not enroll in one army or the other were captured or driven to other lands. When the war ended, much of the territory south of Beneventum was a waste tract, and most of the famous Greek cities on the coast were reduced to a mere handful of poor creatures who huddled together in any corner of their city walls that happened to be left standing. These statistics, as we have them: 400 cities in Italy destroyed by the Romans or Carthaginians or both. The Gallic areas of northern Italy were devastated either by the Carthaginians or by Roman reprisals. The fragmentary statistics that we have in Livy and Polybius tell us that in 218 BC, at the beginning of this war, there were 270,000 Roman citizens. By 208 BC, not at all the end of this war, that was down to 137,000 Roman citizens. That tells us something about the scale of the destruction. Worse than that, perhaps worse than that, Roman armies were recruited from the peasant stock of Italy. The idea in the early days was that you put on your armour, you went off, you fought a 3-week or a 6-week campaign somewhere else in Italy, and then you went back to looking after your land. But this was a war that required Roman armies to operate in Spain and Sicily for years on end, Quite often these soldiers would come home to wastelands, their farms would have disappeared. Then after the war, Italy was opened to completely free importation of food from the industrialized slave farms of Sicily and North Africa. It's not a total disaster because ancient birth rates were very high, and it doesn't matter how many men die in a war. Within 20 years, the losses have been repaired, but the circumstances of Italy from now on were changed. Italy very quickly became a land of giant holdings by a greatly enriched nobility in Rome and Rome's main allied cities, tended by slaves, and the number of free peasant farmers began to dwindle. It dwindled and dwindled to the point where in the late 1st century BC there were serious problems of recruitment to the Roman army, but that's in the future. The effects of victory. The overall effect is that the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifts irrevocably. Rome is now the greatest power not only in the Western Mediterranean, but in the Mediterranean as a whole. The Roman armed forces have been transformed by the Second Punic War. From now on, the Senate knows how to send an army anywhere in the Mediterranean and to maintain it there. There's been a revolution in military tactics, in military organization, and in logistics. The Roman legions have become much more flexible, and they're able to operate anywhere within the Mediterranean world. I've said that Rome began the war with a decisive advantage on sea. As the war proceeded, this advantage grew greater, and this advantage was maintained after the end of the Second Punic War. It meant that Rome controlled the seas not only around the Italian peninsula, but in the whole of the Western Mediterranean, and Rome was the dominant naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean, even if only potentially. You also have a centralization of power. Rome began the Second Punic War as a city-state managing, not ruling, but managing a network of alliances of cities and small states in Italy. It ended the Second Punic War as the capital of Italy, and the Senate now had the prestige to begin functioning as a kind of government with tight control over military and foreign affairs. And there's a rather fanciful image of Rome around the year 200 BC, another of my artificial intelligence generated images, but that probably is roughly how it looked at this time. A large city, a growing city, and an increasingly wealthy city. You can say a lot about the economic costs of the war. The taxes had been very heavy, the devastation had been vast, and the Roman state had spent the better part of 20 years maintaining very large armies outside Italy. But that giant indemnity imposed on Carthage was a great relief afterwards. And you then have the flow of taxes in money and in kind from the new provinces. These allowed for recovery and expansion. The Romans also set about a vast infrastructure project and a project of agricultural development in Italy. Although Italy has been devastated, it does recover very quickly. Rome has now become the biggest colonial power, the only colonial power in the Western Mediterranean. It already has Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. It now has Spain, which is just as rich under Roman rule as it had been under Carthaginian. So Rome has control of the Western Mediterranean, and it's able to project power at will into the Eastern Mediterranean. Another very significant effect of the Second Punic War, perhaps in the long term the most significant effect, is that you have for the first time a large-scale cultural and ideological expansion of Rome into the Western Mediterranean. You have the first expansion of Roman culture, language, law and customs throughout the Western Mediterranean. It is one of the effects of the Second Punic War that France speaks French and Spain speaks Spanish. Indeed, until the 6th century, until the 7th century AD, North Africa was very largely a Latin-speaking part of the Mediterranean world. It's only because of various environmental accidents and the Arab conquest that Latin died out in North Africa. I believe that a Romance language was still spoken in parts of North Africa until the middle of the 16th century. So one of the effects, one of the longer term effects of the Second Punic War was an expansion of Roman civilization throughout the Western Mediterranean. So here is the summary. At the end of the Second Punic War, those green areas are now under direct Roman control. The Romans have Italy again and Sicily. They have Sardinia and Corsica, and they also have this great area in eastern Spain, which over the next century or so is gradually pushed further to the west and further to the north. By 100 BC, 100 years after this treaty with Carthage, you can see that Roman power has expanded into the browny areas. They've taken areas of France, they've taken most of Spain, they've taken much of North Africa, and of course they've taken over Greece and the western part of Asia Minor. So this is the beginning of Rome's imperial expansion, and it's something that has come about because of the Second Punic War. Rome begins the Second Punic War as a considerable regional power. It ends the Second Punic War as the dominant force in the ancient world. Even at the end of the Second Punic War, when Rome was simply the hegemonic power in the Western Mediterranean, this is something that had an immediate and a growing effect on the political, military, economic and cultural life throughout the whole of the Mediterranean world. And it is the fact of Roman domination, even if it's potential domination in the East, that leads Polybius and other Greek intellectuals for the first time to take a serious interest in Rome, because they can see that this is a new and unexpected superpower and is at least potentially their master. Again, I could say much more about the Second Punic War, but I have reached the end of what I can do. Does anybody have any questions?